Fantastic. So thank you so much for the invitation to talk today. So as you heard, I'm Dr. Evie Kendal. I'm a lecturer of health promotion at Swinburne University of Technology. And I should have added something in common. I am also studying a Master of Space Operations at the Australian Defence Force Academy. So that's something a little bit similar to what some of you might be studying. So I'm also the head of the Ethical, Legal, Social Implications of Emerging Technology Research Group. So that's essentially what I'm introducing today. So my plan is just to talk at you for maybe 15, 20 minutes and then to open up for any questions you have. So obviously, I think you should be able to type in the chat function or however that usually works for you. So I'm going to attempt to share my slides. Okay, hopefully that will be visible to you. Fantastic, excellent. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I was discussing at a local symposium that the LCET group ran in Geneva. So introducing some basic ideas about emerging technology ethics using a few case studies so we can discuss those issues there. I see we have a chat. Yes, excellent, fantastic. So starting off with basic genetic ethics, going into specific genetic engineering of astronauts, and then I was thinking of doing a planetary defense case study. So first of all, when we're looking at emerging technology ethics, we're also worried about things like consent, because how do we actually establish informed consent has occurred when the effects of novel technologies are uncertain. So how do you actually get someone to agree to do something in a trial, for example, if we don't know how the technology will actually affect them? Things like reasonable limits of individual freedoms when personal decisions might actually have broad consequences for others in society. So for emerging tech, of course, we're worried about that in general, because we might have impacts for society when we let some people use certain technologies. But we're also particularly concerned in the world of genetics, because what we're dealing with is actually family or group information, not just individual data. So on that individual level, there's the possibility of public misunderstandings about gene tech. They might think risk scores, think they definitely get a disease. And there's the potential for social and psychological harm, because we do have a relatively unregulated testing market. So some of you may have actually done at-home testing and perhaps never engaged with a health professional about that. So we're interested in that in terms of consent and risk. So other things that we're interested in are, of course, as a medical ethicist, an emerging tech ethicist, data privacy and governance. So this is an issue particularly in gene ethics, because we're dealing with family data. So there's a lot of calls to actually move away from the individualism of Beecham and Childress's very famous 1979 principlism for ethics, which basically said autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice are these universal principles for ethics. But they are quite Western-centric, and there's a lot of movement toward being a little more inclusive. So looking at family or societal consent, not just individual freedom. So at our recent symposium in Geneva and the online version that we ran last year, we were very fortunate to hear from various First Nation groups regarding potential alternatives for individual consent that looked more at family or tribal consent. And particularly that was in the United States of America, some of those models. Data ownership and governance is also a really important issue there. So at this point, I want to acknowledge that I'm currently standing on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and to show my respect for their traditional elders, past and present. So the First Nation groups are obviously really at the forefront of these new consent models for emerging tech in genes. So another ethical issue. We're also interested in equity. When we use all this data, who's actually going to benefit from it? We want to make sure we have fair distributions of burdens and benefits so that we don't take advantage of certain population groups. The benefits are including things like new precision medicine. We can help reduce side effects for certain chemotherapies, for example, if we have really good data, but it's often very expensive to use these emerging sort of genetic technologies. So we have inequitable access. We also know at the societal level that gene data and knowledge impacts health equity. So we need to be looking at, is this the best use of our money? But I'm mostly interested in, are there alterations to the human genome that we actually want to stop people doing? So the H versus H plus, as we sometimes call it, or the development of the transhuman. So this ties into the idea of biohacking and bioengineering. So there's a lot of emerging texts that are relevant in this particular area, so I can only really touch on a few. But one of my favorites, because it has a fantastic case in Australia recently, we have, of course, in biohacking and bioengineering, the idea of individuals engaging in extreme modification, prosthetics, things that are much stronger than human bone, but also what we call insidables. So things that we can actually inject inside of ourselves to make us transhuman or superhuman in some way. And our recent case that went to court was a fantastically named individual, Meow-Ludo Disco Gamma Meow-Meow, that's his name. He decided that he wanted to implant the chip of his transportation card, so the RFID, under his skin so that he could get on and off the train just by waving his hand. And of course, the data that people are implanting on these chips is another issue as well for security. So this gentleman was actually fined. They said what he did was a crime. Turns out it actually wasn't, so that was overturned. The issue was that the judges wanted to essentially make an example of him as a deterrent, but it's not actually legal to do that. At the time, he wasn't actually committing a crime, so they had to overturn that decision. We're also very interested in what we call garage CRISPR-Cas9, so people actually engaging in gene modification in their own garage. So that's another area of biohacking. So transhumanism is becoming more and more achievable through this DIY hacking. And we have some researchers talking about these insidable or implant parties, where people are essentially meeting together to have these things implanted in their bodies. And Plough and Boddington say what we're actually seeing is a gathering together of a new biocitizen group. So they're agitating, as opposed to being disease communities, they're just groups of people with a similar interest in human enhancement. A lot of it is also focused on anti-aging technology. So they're agitating, they're pressuring governments and organizations for access, price, quality, availability of treatments and cures, or what we call the fruits of biotechnology. So that includes people who are biohacking using CRISPR-Cas9. They're just this new biocitizen group that have these interests in common. So this anti-aging focus and cosmetic body work that we see is very similar to some of the direct-to-consumer ancestry and so-called epigenetic age testing that you can actually buy at the pharmacist. But what we're concerned about, of course, is who has that data, who's governing it. This is family information, and that can be quite problematic. If we want to look at the institutional level rather than just the individual, we might be concerned about employers trying to enhance the workforce to get more out of them. So they may seek these kind of enhancements to optimize the workforce. So Gao notes that regulatory documents regarding gene editing typically focus on 4 scientific concerns, those being off-target effects, on-target effects, epigenetic effects, and chimerism, and various social justice concerns predominantly focused on inequitable access on socioeconomic grounds. So off-target issues refer to when modifications occur at the wrong place in the genome, whereas on-target effects refer to when the correct target is isolated but with unintended results, such as large deletions, translocations, or activation of cancer-causing oncogenes. Unfortunately, that was actually seen with gene therapy recipients for X-linked severe combined immunodeficiency, or SCID, who unfortunately developed leukemia following abnormal activation of the LMO2 protein coding gene. So some of those patients developed leukemia. But the more interesting element, of course, is according to Seed House, NASA is currently considering both genetic and epigenetic modifications for astronauts, the latter being focused on changing the way the body reads genes without affecting the underlying DNA. So epigenetic changes can dictate gene activation, deactivation, protein transcription, and reactions to environment and behavior, thereby altering phenotypic expression without changing the DNA sequence. However, under epigenetic effects, Gao notes the risk, for example, that the insertion of a radiation resistance gene is epigenetically turned off, rendering the genetic modification useless. Finally, chimerism refers to when the gene modification does not occur in all target cells, leading to a mixture of modified and unmodified genes in the recipient. For all of these issues, the possible effects range from having no impact to diminishing the effectiveness of an intervention or natural process, to knocking out entire essential processes for the organism's survival. So the proteins that certain genes encode may develop toxic or even lethal function. We can very reasonably ask whether these are risks we want to be avoiding at the species level, but also whether we think institutions should be banned from promoting a sort of genetics arms race among citizens and employees. But the other issue that I'm concerned about as an ethicist is where we actually find the target genes for genetic engineering in the global population. And the reality is we're finding a lot of them in indigenous cultural groups. So what we're seeing is a form of bioprospecting, which refers to investigating living things to find commercially valuable biochemical processes or properties that can include various genetic traits, and sort of exploiting those for profit. So using the NASA example again, they would be looking for mutations that would confer survival advantage for people operating in extreme environments. So reduced oxygen pressure, extreme temperature, reduced access to fresh food and water, and enhanced radiation resistance. According to Sharp and Braddock, there's numerous examples of human extremophiles, so people who are adapted to these conditions. They show adaptation to things like reduced oxygen levels, including the Bajau people of Indonesia, who have shown evolutionary adaptation to hypoxia. And they did this by developing larger than average spleens where oxygenated red blood cells can be stored. This adaptation is owed to alterations to a gene involved in thyroid hormone level regulation and is believed to have occurred due to the cultural practice of sustained breath hold diving. So these authors also note genetic factors found among Tibetans, Andeans, and Ethiopians living at high altitudes that confer advantages for gaseous exchange in the respiratory system, including mutations in 5 different genes. Now, obviously, I do have the lists of all these genes, but because it's just a series of letters and numbers, it's a bit boring. But if anyone is interested, I can give them the list. So these mutations all have relevance to adapting to low pressure environments as well, including 5 other candidates for high and low pressure adaptation. Some polymorphisms of NOS3, for example, have been shown to protect against neuronal injury in hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy among the Chinese Han population, where that particular condition is unfortunately occurring at much higher levels. Key et al. Finally found that a variant of the TRPM8 gene was present in very different frequencies among populations according to local temperature conditions, finding a 5% frequency in Nigeria, but 88% in Finland. These authors state this gene encodes for a cation channel that is to date the only temperature receptor known to mediate an endogenous response to moderate cold. So essentially, if NASA wants to target this and actually genetically engineer these astronauts to be more resilient to the very harsh environment of space, they will essentially be isolating it from these communities. When it comes to adapting to food and water shortages, Argentinian Andes populations have shown increased tolerance to arsenic due to selective pressure for a specific allele of a gene involved in arsenic metabolism. Adaptations to high-fat diets needed to provide enough energy to survive in low temperatures have also been seen at 5 different gene locations in Siberian people and Inuit populations in Greenland. Meanwhile, studies of various Arctic populations have found extreme cold and the lack of available dietary plants for much of the year has led to genetic adaptations involving the CPT1A gene, which some of you may have heard about because it has a number of other applications as well. This is involved in fatty acid oxidation. So according to Hale, the relevant variant underwent one of the strongest known selective sweeps in human history and is specific to Inuit and Yupik populations where it may compensate for low carbohydrate and high protein consumption. Adaptations involving genes associated with elevated serum urate levels, which have a role in preventing dehydration, have also been found in Australian Indigenous communities. Perhaps a little more fun, of course, if we're thinking about emerging tech and the ethics and law of that, we have things like splicing in genes from animals as well, or from bacteria. So for radiation resistance, we're looking at potentially splicing in some Deinococcus radiodurans or a tardigrade specific D-sub genes. That one's fun. And there's also some talk about, could we actually stimulate humans to go into hibernation, because that's a radioprotective state. But all of this demonstrates the conserved genes required for genetic enhancement are mostly found in remote and indigenous populations. And in many cases, they bear the risks, particularly risks of discrimination, loss of data privacy, outside governance of this research when it won't necessarily benefit them directly. So we do try to attempt to address this by engaging in sample repatriation, so sending back samples to the communities they were taken from, and bioreparations that also try and take into account the effect of transgenerational trauma on the epigenome and health. So under usual circumstances, I go into some detail about these anticipatory ethics and other methods of dealing with emerging tech, but I know that we'll have some questions to cover that. So I'm just going to define some of these terms because that will help when we have discussion. So if you've read the paper, you'll already know the different forms of emerging technology ethics that I've been applying to cases like this genetic enhancement issue. Precautionary principle, which translates any potential for harm in the face of scientific uncertainty into a positive duty for stakeholders to act to prevent or mitigate harm. Design ethics, such as value-sensitive design, which tries to identify relevant human values during technology research and development phases to ensure they're promoted and respected by the design. Ethical technology assessment, designed by Palm and Hansen, which adjusts development in line with ethical concerns when there's an emerging tech and tries to guide decision-making. So these authors developed a checklist with 9 items that, if implicated in an emerging tech, indicate an ethical technology assessment should be done. So that includes things like any technology that might impact concepts of privacy or have direct impact on gender minorities and concepts of justice. Most of the emerging techs that we're dealing with in this talk would fit into several of their criteria. Anticipatory ethics and governance promotes a future care-oriented responsible innovation framework that protects the public trust in science and technology. Scenario approaches, and this is where you get to talk about things like Star Trek. They analyze hypothetical scenarios and consider how technology and ethics both change in tandem when new technologies emerge. And these are just some of the possible ethical frameworks that we can apply to things like biohacking, bioprospecting, genetic engineering, consent models for new tech, data management, and equitable distribution of burdens and benefits of research. But because I heard that you might have an interest in some of this space research, I've got 3 of the different publications up on the screen now. So essentially, a space ethicist just gets asked to consult on issues that are relevant to space, and we apply existing frameworks to these novel problems, or where necessary, design new frameworks. So the first one that I was asked to consult on was actually a planetary defense project, which looked at how do we actually protect the Earth from asteroids and comets that are on an impact trajectory with us. So after looking at the options that we had, I thought a doctrine of double effect was probably our best bet, because what we're dealing with is essentially something that has good and bad consequences. So the good is saving the planet, and the bad depends on what tech we're using as to what are the possible negative ramifications. So for the doctrine of double effect, of course, we have 4 criteria. You're probably familiar with this doctrine already. But our 4 criteria is what you do has to be ethical, independent of its consequences. So it doesn't let you just get away with anything. The thing you do must be acceptable in its own right. Your bad side effect must be foreseen but not intended. It cannot be the method of achieving your good outcome, and risk-benefit analysis should justify it. So essentially, I was given 4 different texts to run through this framework. And the first was nuclear explosive devices. Now, these can destroy asteroids and comets on impact trajectory that are discovered really late. So if any of you have gone to the Planetary Defense Conference, you'll probably realize they almost always end up with this option. But there's no need to land or couple with the target. And another benefit is that we actually understand NED tech really quite well at this stage. The cons are, of course, the explosion would need to be accurate to a fraction of a second. It is currently illegal to detonate nuclear explosives in space. Hopefully we're all on the same page with that one. The risk of fragment landing on us or nuclear fallout is a major problem, of course. But one of the issues that I was most concerned about was the risk of destigmatizing nuclear proliferation. So all of a sudden, if we say we can use NEDs for planetary defense, everyone can stockpile them, and that really undermines the project of deproliferation. So according to the doctrine of double effect, we would generally say, because the method is involved in something that's quite problematic, it would fail to pass that criteria. There's a number of dual use dilemmas there. Number 2, kinetic impactors. So essentially our asteroid is hurtling toward us and we send a ship up there just to bump it off its trajectory. It is the most straightforward method, and proof of concept already exists. That's been established. The cons are, of course, it depends on knowing the mass of the target. You require significant advance notice of the predicted impact. There's a risk of fragments landing on us and a risk of redirecting the asteroid into a keyhole, so essentially guaranteeing it's going to come and hit us next time. So the doctrine of double effect will allow us to use this tech only if the risk-benefit analysis plays out well. Our next one is a gravity tractor, so a much bigger craft that we send up there that will actually drag the asteroid using gravitational force off its trajectory, so it's no longer an impact hazard for us. So it does not require knowledge of the target composition or shape, and the orbits can be trimmed precisely to miss those keyhole issues. The cons are you require significant advance notice of the predicted impact, far more so than the kinetic impactors. And it requires very large spaceships with the ability to rendezvous with the target. So here, doctrine of double effect is probably going to allow you to use this, but there are many practical constraints that means it may not actually be possible. And the final thing was the team I was working with were actually coming up with a design for a theoretical moon laser. So this could respond to threats with very short notice and could be developed with a non-nuclear power source. And this is where an emerging technology ethics framework comes into effect, because we've looked at the NEDs and said they could cause problems on Earth. So that would make us think design ethics. How about we put that in our design and actually have a non-nuclear source so it can't be misused? The cons are the source would need to have significant power, very, very power hungry. Usually requires asteroid despinning to focus your beam on the correct orbital vector. And depending on the position, the laser could actually be weaponized for terrestrial conflict or miss threats on one side. So you can put it on the dark side of the moon, but of course that means you can't shoot anything in between us and the moon. It does stop people from actually using it in terrestrial warfare though. So that's the major case study. That was planetary defense. Of course, the human enhancement one, I've discussed the current state of the science there, that we're trying to engage in some form of genetic engineering for astronauts. The final one there is just basically OH&S for the moon. And of course, OH&S is not our favorite topic, but when you put it in space, it's suddenly a lot more interesting. So worker rights and making sure that we look after those vulnerable populations in space. So that is all I have by means of introduction for you, and hopefully people have some questions.
And indeed they do. Indeed they do. We do have a question from Mr. Trigoda, and I'll just read it because it's a multi-part question, and so it's very cool. Okay, so in terms of legal, we've got a lot of lawyers here. So so in terms of legal implications and legal risk, if an individual engages in genetic modifications, if the individual has an existing life insurance policy, can you speak to whether such activity would or should be required disclosure or considered high risk for insurance carriers to ask? And then it continues on by saying, would such insurance policies become null and void? And please touch on privacy concerns. And then there's an additional question, but I can hold the additional part of the question until the first part is answered.
Yeah. Well, I suspect your laws are actually quite different to ours, but essentially, if you undergo a genetic test of any kind, in Australia, you do have to disclose the results to life insurers, for example, health insurers. So it depends a bit on obviously the policy wording there, but there are certainly examples where you are required to disclose that information, and that's just from a genetic test. So I can only imagine that anything that's actually engaging in genetic engineering or any of that sort of biohacking, I believe they would absolutely consider that to be something that, if not disclosed, would be potentially voiding that policy. They're quite strict on that here. Obviously, your situation is probably quite a bit different. We have very different insurance sort of norms here, but we are expected to disclose any sort of test results that we have, any genetic knowledge that we have in terms of ourselves before we can actually have these policies. And the warning is, of course, that they will be voided if it turns out that like you had that knowledge and you did not disclose it. So when it comes to privacy, of course, the real issue there is if one of your family gets one of these tests, your privacy has already been implicated by that, because you do have that genetic relationship with that person, and a lot can be sort of inferred about your genetics from someone else in your family getting one of these tests done. So we're very careful when we advise people to engage with this kind of tech. Usually there'll also be an expectation legally that these kinds of things are done by qualified healthcare professionals. So one of the issues with like the implant parties are, of course, most of them were not hiring a doctor to come and do these incisions and implant this tech. So essentially your health insurer could classify that as a form of self-harm, so self-inflicted injury. And for some policies, of course, that would be a void issue as well. So if you were to get something like an infection from an implant party, they may say that they're not going to cover that because it was not done under a professional sort of health medical practitioner. So I'm not sure how much of the question I've sort of looked at there. So, I mean, an insurer could in the future choose to take on these high risk cases, but I suspect they're going to be quite risk averse and actually not insure people who are engaging in biohacking. It's not done enough to have actually really been considered much by the companies, though.
And I appreciate those comments, Dr. Kendal. I mean, we see kind of a semi-large movement here in the United States, and again, no federal endorsements intended here, but one that comes to mind is 23andMe, or other companies that are either advertising with extreme amounts of caveats in their packaging to say, hey, you may be able to screen for certain genetic issues that could lead to genetically related diseases later on in your life, or in the alternative, some of them are almost for entertainment purposes. And I'll put this out to our audience as well, because I know I see some of the names here, and I know there's a great deal of depth of knowledge in many of these spaces. But the other idea is like, well, hey, where is my family from, or how much Neanderthal genetics do I have in my system? Those kinds of things seem to be of considerable use, and people are tending to do that. Almost not necessarily have implant parties, but have genetic parties. Like, oh, hey, I'm 3.5% Neanderthal, and what are you? Those kinds of things. So
yeah, absolutely.
So,
and I guess, I mean, I just wanted to add, because it's probably not that well known, but in Australia, direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising is illegal. So whenever you watch TV and they're advertising this company and this drug and this intervention, all of that's illegal here. So we don't have any of that. So something like 23andMe operating here would only be able to sell themselves as an ancestry testing, not as a health product.
No, and we might be able to take a lesson out of that playbook here as well. So I'll continue on with Mr. Tagada's question. So he also said, please discuss such a disclosure across all financial accounts, such as individual may have, where they may be able to, quote, hack or game the system for their personal benefit at the expense of society. So in other words, from what I understand, and Philip, please correct me if I'm getting this incorrect, but if kind of a almost a dystopian way, like taking somebody else's genetics and maybe lowering your rates, by having by advertising yourself to be genetically superior than you really are, perhaps. And Philip, please correct me if I've mischaracterized that, but that was my take.
I don't know whether the question askers are actually able to speak. Sometimes webinars automatically mute them, so I don't know if they can actually talk.
Yeah, this particular format won't allow that, but please, this allows us to go ahead and have the Q&A and then express it. Again, this is mainly user error on my part. I want to just this is the default, and so I'll learn as I go, probably more sophisticated means to do that.
Yeah, so when it comes to the gaming and hacking issue, I am concerned about individuals doing things that could harm the rest of us, like at the species level, because you can imagine that some people having some skills will actually significantly diminish the competitive advantage in like the workplace of other people who don't engage in that. So one of the examples from a transhumanism project that I was working on was there are people who are trying to get things implanted in them that would actually turn them into a human compass. So something would actually occur in their brain when they are facing north. And you can imagine that for certain workplaces, that could be very helpful. You would actually always know which way you're facing. You'd be able to, direct groups of people without access to any other tech. Other people are obviously trying to basically install night vision in themselves at all times. And of course, we've got others who are trying to remove the need for sleep. So they would be able to work, 24 hours a day. And I'm concerned very much about that being misused by corporations, organizations, and governments more than individuals. But of course, individuals will contribute to that issue. Other people say, of course, if we do allow some people to go without sleep, just imagine the benefits in surgery for the rest of us. If, a surgeon could just work for, 60 hours straight without sleep, maybe that would be a wonderful benefit. Others are saying, of course, if we engage in some of the emerging sort of cognitive enhancement, just imagine the diseases we could cure if even one person takes the risk and actually enhances their cognition to that degree. Now, keeping in mind, a lot of this is speculative. So I do emerging technology. Some of these technologies actually never happen, which is one of the risks in emerging tech, that you'll spend all this time thinking about what should be done for something that actually never happens. But it is interesting to think about individuals using their personal liberty can actually seriously damage equal opportunity and advantages for other people. Absolutely.
And thank you for those insights, Dr. Kendal. I do have some questions, but we have other questions coming in while we're waiting for folks to type in other questions. Looking at the paper itself, it had a great summary of a number of articles and a number of works that folks had done during your symposium. But I wondered if you might share with us, sort of the impetus or the reason why your research institution and your school focused on this as a conference overall. If you might have some words on that.
Yeah, so a few different things actually. So the LTWRC group was originally funded by the Science and Society Network at Deakin University, and we've recently been essentially adopted by my new institution, and we're now housed in the Iverson Health Innovation Technology Institute. So initially, the interest was because the Science and Society Network looks at the intersection between science and society, obviously, but basically people and technology. And the same interests are obviously very prominent at Swinburne. Their moonshots are all about, making the world better for people by using technology in an ethical, sustainable way. So that's sort of better living through technology. So it was always going to be quite a popular idea. So the original symposium, we had quite a few people actually come to Deakin University and present their research. And then, of course, we had an open call, which is what this particular editorial is collecting. So a variety of different things. Some of them were, well, actually quite a few of them were genetic based. Then we had, CRISPR-Cas9 used in malaria treatments. And then looking at other things like artificial womb technology, which is actually one of my specialties. And then, of course, we had the symposium over in Geneva, which only looked at the emerging genetics and epigenetics. And that one was funded by the Brochet Foundation. So it was particularly interested in indigenous cultures and rights and genetic research involving those communities. So it's actually had a few different sort of gatherings. And if anyone is interested in that kind of work, we do also have an open call for publications in precision medicine and equity. So that's, I believe it's advertised in the paper that you've seen, but otherwise you can find it online if you put in precision medicine and equity. So yeah, just a variety of different things that brought people together. So the LCIP group has, I think, about 80 members in 6 different countries, I think, at this stage. And they're a mixture of lawyers, scientists, philosophers, technology specialists, everyone interested in this kind of intersection between society and technology.
Well, thank you very much for that background. It's extremely helpful. The paper also has, and you do a great job of summarizing some of the approaches that people took from various ethical models, and I thank you very much for the introduction of defining some of those. But in your research, did you find that one sort of fit in this category better, or was better better able to go ahead and interpret data in this particular area versus others, and sort of what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it tends to be more cultural. So like precautionary principle absolutely dominates European Union addresses of particularly genetic tech. So that's a particularly interesting one there. So that principle just dominates their approach to things like genetically modified crops, that kind of thing. And the United States of America is often seen more as an approach that will wait and see. So we sometimes just refer to it as the wait and see group. So essentially bringing in the tech, and if there are problems, it tends to get mopped up in the legal system rather than in the technology development, research and development side. So you'll often have it's more reactive. So wait until something actually goes wrong and then deal with it. Whereas the other approach is, of course, very precautionary, saying, well, don't do it if there's a risk of significant harm. But one of the sort of issues that we have with the precautionary principle, of course, is if your goal is saving lives and curing diseases, you could say that there is significant harm in not doing the research. So the precautionary principle says don't do it if there's harm, but not doing it is also the harm. So you end up with a bit of a paradox there. So of course, I like the value sensitive design because it has that sort of staged experimentation. So it allows you to have this sort of controlled experiment where you determine if there's a problem, an ethical problem, if there's harm to populations, and then you adapt and refine as you go. The problem there is that's not how science gets funded. It doesn't get funded in little bits. It's a big project that gets the grant, and the big project doesn't necessarily have those easy stopping points when a problem comes up. So I think it's partly the need to change how we fund research and how we do research so that we can engage those sort of ethical technological assessments as part of the process, and understand that when a grant is given for a project, if there is a significant risk of harm that's determined at one of those controlled experiments, that we actually have to abandon the plan that we had, refine it and do something else, hopefully achieving the same goal, but we might be doing it in a very different way. And the funder may not like the new way that we have to do things, so that can be quite problematic. So yeah, I think it's more a cultural thing as to which actual method gets followed.
No, and thank you for that. I in reading the paper, I saw that there was a lot of attention paid to value sensitive design, and I was wondering what your thoughts were on how that addresses like other types of emerging technology. And I know before we had our chat here today that we had an opportunity to talk a little bit about quantum computing, and quantum computers. One of the promises of quantum computing is that it's able to model, large scale interactions, drug interactions with the human body, modeling chemical reactions long before they're ever even tested in sort of a real world context. And so I would very much appreciate your thoughts on what types of these ethical models we could use to approach and interpret some of those types of emerging technology, quantum computing being one of them, or even quantum AI, or in the AI space. I would be interested in your thoughts in that area.
Yeah, I think the value-sensitive design is probably going to be the most useful there, because it will look at, okay, what are the implications? And of course, when we're dealing with large data, the number one implication is always going to be privacy. So we've got that issue. How do we make sure that this data is protected? What's our data security, governance models, etc. If it's particularly sensitive data, then of course you'll have to have significant moves in terms of that security and how you're going to manage that. So the value sensitive design is going to look for the value and then design it in a way that's protective of that value. So if there's, significant risk of discrimination, then of course the value that we're looking at there is, equity, equality, that kind of thing. So how do we make sure that when we design these systems that we're using them in a way that's equitable and that is promoting equal opportunity and not leading to discrimination? So again, it's not necessarily going to be the easiest way to design systems. It takes extra steps, which means obviously it causes delays and it costs money. So having it sort of embedded in that system will be difficult, but I think it is going to be the most practical solution there. And of course, it does interact with those other models as well. So with the anticipatory ethics and governance, it's looking at predicting what might go wrong and how we can sort of change that, but also predicting how humans are going to behave with a new piece of technology. So it's often the case that technology actually impacts our morals in the same way that sort of morals will impact the kind of technology we want. So once something exists, sometimes our models of what's right and wrong actually change because of this new piece of technology. It makes us rethink things in a particular way. So it's not like morality is static and technology is attacking our values. Our values actually shift when new technology comes out to some extent. So being sort of aware of that as well, but a lot of it is predictive. So it's looking at what is the most likely outcome, what are the potential extreme outcomes, and how do we make sure we don't have any of those really negative extreme reactions without basically getting rid of all the good things that we could have come up with this tech if it's used appropriately. But yeah, definitely something that's looking at research and development stages.
No, that's thank you very much for those comments. What I'm still looking for questions in the chat box. If folks are having difficulty with that, please let me know. I'm not exactly sure how that would happen. I've opened the question box up to everyone, so everybody can see everybody's questions, just to make sure we have that facilitated and it's not user error on my part. I did note one of your comments at the beginning of the discussion about chimerism, and was wondering if you could maybe expand on some of those remarks, because some people, and I know when I hear the kind of the term chimerism is like, oh, it's right on the horizon, we can't get to it, it's a technology that we would like to get to, but it's just always elusive, and so I would be very interested in your thoughts on chimerism and how that interplay works in this space.
Yeah, do you mean like trans species?
Yeah, yes, indeed.
Yeah, excellent. So, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about the kind of traits that we might want to take from animal species, or particularly at the moment, it's mostly bacteria, actually. So things that we might want to splice out using CRISPR-Cas9 so that we could have certain abilities that humans don't naturally possess. So anything that involves a sort of trans species, anything animal-human hybrid does get escalated in an ethical review process. So that's an automatic thing that tends to happen worldwide. Anything that's going to be using different species and sort of engaging in that sort of transgenic organism creation is going to be very heavily sort of reviewed and regulated in usual circumstances. So, I mean, we do have some of these things existing already. We do have medical application of things that we have taken from animals, of course. We do that in transplant science a lot. But when it comes to like splicing something into our genome, theoretically, we can do it, theoretically, using CRISPR-Cas9. But because there's all these massive risks of off-target mutations, even on-target mutations, there are so many ways that we can actually splice it incorrectly. We can't find what our target genes. Obviously, the actual clinical application is in its infancy. But I mean, the tech does exist, it is solid. but whether or not it's ever going to yield the benefits that it was originally sort of touted to have, we haven't seen it yet. We don't have many gene therapies that are successful consistently. That which we do have does still have risks and negative side effects, of course. But again, it was a bit of a gold rush back in the day, and then it didn't quite deliver the original promise. So how far it's going to get, obviously, is sort of difficult to predict. But anything that's going to be sort of introducing sort of foreign DNA is going to be very ethically challenging. People have very strong views about sort of altering the human genome in that way. But yes, as to how far and how successful we'll be, I guess we shall see.
Indeed, and thank you for those remarks. And as I'm working through here, I'm trying to unmute people in case people have live comments, for whatever reason are not able to chat. So I'm in the process of doing that at the moment. Also, I did want to sort of get your thoughts on the big picture of some of the findings that you were seeing from the LCIT conference, and even conferences that are similar in thematics, to sort of get your kind of big picture findings and the trends that you're seeing out there.
Yeah, one of the main trends that we're seeing is concern about big data. So there's a lot of concern about big data and how it's going to be used, and things like machine learning. And one of the major concerns that people have with machine learning and AI is, of course, that the algorithms are just engaging in the same problems that humans have as a group. So we're finding the algorithms are racist because the algorithms learned from us. So we have problems where you've got AI systems that are supposed to be helping us. You'll probably know that there are some that are used in sentencing. So it looks at, what's the algorithm, what's the rate of recidivism in this particular population, and then obviously tries to sentence people according to that algorithm. As of course we know that those programs have been problematic from an ethical perspective. So again, that's probably one of the main trends that I'm seeing. So, AI and how we're using this big data, so the privacy concerns, the data security, but also the fact that when a whole bunch of people are contributing their data, a lot of human foibles come with it. So we do see a lot of discrimination actually at the end result of some of this machine learning.
Excellent. Thank you for those. Thank you for those remarks. And now, in your research, is your university or your institution, are they partnering with other institutions in this area or others? And what does that look like? How is that working?
Yeah, well, because the LCIT group has only just sort of been adopted a few months ago, actually, we are planning to have a symposium of some kind actually on our campus soon, and I don't know any further details about that right now, but essentially we liaise with lots of different people. We have members, as I said, around the world. They have different specialties, and for the most part the group just brings people together. So if we have someone who is interested in, ethics of AI, they might want to partner with someone who's familiar with the legal status of that tech in a particular country, and then we'll try and put those people together so that they can work on publications or projects. So for the most part, it's mostly just bringing people together with similar interests, but we do have plans to actually run an event that will bring in some different areas of the university, but also it's not limited to that. So very welcoming for new members to come join us.
Outstanding. I'll probably be the first in line because this area is extremely interesting, especially when it comes to genetics. I know we're coming close to the hour. I did have one last question, and I would again invite anyone to come off mute and ask questions directly of Dr. Kendal. One of the things, and it may have been something that has been a subject of other work that you've done, is heritable genes. So the idea of once you've made a genetic modification, that it can be inherited in certain ways. So I'd be interested in your perspectives on that in particular as well.
Yeah. So the most recent thing I did that actually touched on heritable genes is obviously quite speculative, so it won't have immediate relevance to what you're saying. But we were looking at if we allow people to genetically modify themselves to survive on Mars, for example, what happens when they have children that carry on those traits so that they can also, you know, breathe in that almost complete lack of atmosphere. And what if they want to go home? What if they want to go back to Earth and now they can't breathe here? So do they have a right to actually access their species sort of home planet? But more importantly, of course, we're looking at, can we reverse the changes that we've made? So essentially we came up with a list of criteria as to what would be essentially permissible under most circumstances, ones that would only be permissible under very limited circumstances, like if it was a survival issue, and then of course ones that we would say we probably should not be permitting this, and the ones that were significantly altering their natural state, ones that were not reversible, ones that were quite invasive, and particularly ones that required repeated exposure to the genetic therapy. Because of course, it's not always the case that you do something once and then it carries. Sometimes there has to be repeated invasive interventions. So we were saying essentially, if it's in that category where it's significantly altering natural state and it's not reversible, etc., and it's likely to be quite inconvenient for the person just trying to live their life, that we perhaps wouldn't be allowing that moving forward. But something that was desperately needed for someone to survive, of course, the risk benefit shifts quite a lot there. And with heritable genes, of course, often that's what we're dealing with as well. If it's something that is perhaps a lethal mutation that's been naturally acquired, if we engage in a gene therapy that gets rid of that, obviously we don't want that person to then have a child with that lethal, you know, mutation. So the issue there becomes, do we allow them to engage in a gene therapy that will also treat their children, given the fact that children don't give consent for that treatment? And at the current moment, of course, those treatments would also be experimental, which adds another dimension of concern ethically when it comes to, you know, safety, patient consent, etc. So often they say, well, the child will simply have to be treated as an individual patient later, as opposed to actually dealing with it further up sort of the germline, so to speak.
Outstanding. No, and I appreciate those remarks greatly. That's very insightful. We do have another question from Tabitha Bonney from the UK Ministry of Defense. This question is, in relation to digital AI technologies in prosthetics, have you given any thought to obligations on providers to update through life of the recipient? And then there's a second part of the question, but I'll leave the first question first, and then we'll get to the second part of the question in a moment.
Yeah. So you mean to alter the prosthetic to grow with the patient? Is that the idea?
I believe so, but I'll leave that to Tabitha to maybe jump in if that's yes. Okay, she says yes. Okay.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I mean, I would always argue in favor of the best support that we can give people with the resources that we have available. So with something that can actually grow with the patient, of course, one of our best resources is 3D printing. So 3D printing is great for prosthetics and obviously altering the prosthetics as particularly a child would grow. So that can be very valuable to them. I would say essentially if you're, well, one of the issues is once you engage in an intervention, you are responsible for sort of what happens from there. So on the one hand, not offering the prosthetic in the first place, you might say, well, I'm off the hook. I don't have to do anything after this point because, you know, it's not my fault that that child was born without that limb or lost that limb in an accident or whatever. And that is, of course, true. It's not your fault. But if we agree that every citizen has the right to healthcare and has the right to what Norman Daniels would say, you know, the normal opportunity range for someone at their life stage, that normal species functioning, as he says, then you'd say, well, I mean, normal species functioning, and I'm saying normal as in typical here, statistically typical. means that you would have X number of limbs and they would be capable of this degree of motion, etc. So if someone is in a situation where they don't meet that typical sort of norm, they would then have a justification for state-funded prosthetics. And once you engage in that intervention, you are then responsible, of course, for keeping them at that level of functioning. So I would say it was obviously cruel to give someone a prosthetic as a child and then not actually allow them to keep that functionality as they grow older. But it is an example of where emerging tech is actually really valuable. So things like what we're printing in 3D printing for prosthetics is so much better and so much more adjustable than what we've been able to make previously, which is great. And hopefully one day the dream is that we'll be able to print some organs. I would love to print some organs for transplant. That's obviously not happening at the moment, but some complex organs would be wonderful.
Outstanding. Thank you for that. And I think you may have answered this second part in part anyhow. Additionally, would reversion to a prosthetic with no advanced functionality then be a form of damage to the individual, extending maybe that first idea that you were discussing?
Well, I think what's interesting there, of course, is it depends on the lived experience of the individual, because some individuals actually want to low tech the prosthetic after they've tried something. They just like, actually, no, I don't want that level of functionality. And this is more common with things like cochlear implants or hearing aids. People say, actually, no, I want to go back to a lower level of hearing sensitivity because for some people, it's actually quite painful having hearing at that sensitivity. So I think the individual could absolutely opt for something sort of downgraded, I suppose, technologically speaking. But I would definitely argue that if we have given something at a certain level, that we should be maintaining it in terms of functionality. That may not mean we're giving them exactly the same thing, of course. And things will get cheaper as we design them. So one of the benefits, of course, of still allowing people to have extremely expensive health technologies is that over time they do get cheaper, they do become more accessible for others as well. But yes, I would say once we've committed to a certain standard, I wouldn't want to be sort of reverting that if we can avoid it.
Outstanding. Well, I do know that we are coming right up on the hour, and thank you so very much, Dr. Kendal, for sharing your insights and your research and your thoughts with us. This has been a wonderful conversation. We thank you very much again for joining us. I know it's the early hours. I believe it's almost 1 o'clock in the morning there.
1 a.m. Yes.
Yes, indeed. Okay, so thank you very much for pulling an all-nighter with us here in the U.S. This has been fantastically insightful. And thank you very much for your participation today.
And thank you for all the great questions. Obviously, there's no talk with no questions. So it is great to hear from people.